He ordered the execution of 84 American prisoners of war in a snowy Belgian field. He burned Soviet civilians alive in a Ukrainian village. He was sentenced to death by an American military court, and then he walked free. Not because he was innocent, not because the evidence was weak, but because politics decided his life was worth more than justice. That decision, made in a boardroom, not a battlefield, is what ultimately got him killed. His name was Joachim Peiper. And before you write him off as just another Nazi villain in a long list of them, stop. Because his story isn't just about what he did, it's about what happened after. And that second half of the story is where history gets genuinely uncomfortable. This man was tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and then released. Through legal maneuvering, political convenience, and Cold War calculations, one of the most documented war criminals of the Western Front simply walked out and lived for decades. Until one night in the summer of 1976, his house in a quiet French village was set on fire while he slept inside. His burned remains were found the next morning. The case was never officially solved, and honestly, that unresolved ending is what makes this story impossible to forget. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. Joachim Peiper was born in Berlin in 1915. By the time he was a teenager, Germany had lost World War I, suffered the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, and watched its economy collapse so completely that people burned paper currency as firewood because it was cheaper than actual wood. The Nazi Party didn't just recruit desperate people, it manufactured them first and then recruited them. At just 23 years old, Peiper became a personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, the chief architect of the Holocaust. Not a battlefield role, a front row seat to where the orders were being made. And here's my honest take on that. Peiper later claimed he didn't know the full scope of the Holocaust while working directly beside Himmler. I don't buy it for a second. As Himmler's personal adjutant, he traveled with the man, organized his schedule, and witnessed SS operations firsthand across Eastern Europe. That claim of ignorance wasn't honesty. It was survival instinct dressed up as testimony. He was inside the machine, and he stayed there willingly. On the Eastern Front, Peiper's unit earned a nickname that tells you everything: the Blowtorch Battalion. Not because of their speed, not because of their firepower, because of what they left behind. His forces burned Soviet villages to the ground and executed civilians as collective punishment. In one of the most savage acts attributed to his command, approximately 240 men, women, and children were burned alive, locked inside a church that was then set on fire as retaliation for the wounding of just 2 SS officers. 2 SS officers wounded, 872 people killed, hundreds of them burned alive inside a church. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because here's what genuinely haunts me about this case. Peiper was never tried for any of his Eastern Front crimes, not once. The tribunal that eventually caught up with him focused only on Belgium. The Soviet victims, the burned villages, the massacred civilians got nothing. No trial, no verdict, no acknowledgement in any formal court of law. That justice gap didn't disappear. It just went underground, and it would resurface 30 years later in the most violent way possible. December 17th, 1944, Belgium, the Baugny Crossroads. Peiper's armored column captured approximately 113 American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans had surrendered. They were disarmed, gathered into a field, and standing with their hands up. Then SS machine gunners opened fire. 84 men were killed. Survivors later testified that SS soldiers walked through the field, delivering finishing shots to anyone still moving. Over 40 Americans survived by pressing their faces into the freezing mud and staying absolutely still, listening to the boots of their executioners walking just inches away. But here's the fact that most people never hear. Malmedy was just one incident among many. Over the entire Battle of the Bulge campaign, Peiper's unit was held responsible for killing approximately from 300 to over 500 American POWs and 111 Belgian civilians. The trial focused on Malmedy because the evidence was strongest there, but the full scale was far larger, and that detail matters deeply when you're trying to understand what came next. At the Dachau Military Tribunal in 1946, 43 SS members were sentenced to death for the Malmedy Massacre. Peiper was at the top of that list. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivor testimonies were detailed and consistent. And then, slowly, systematically, the sentences collapsed. Senator Joseph McCarthy intervened, claiming confessions had been obtained through torture. Some of those allegations had partial merit. There were documented concerns about the initial interrogation methods. But even setting those aside, the physical evidence and survivor testimonies alone were more than sufficient for conviction. Here is my personal read on what actually happened. America needed West Germany. The Cold War was escalating, the Soviet threat was real, and a rearmed, rehabilitated West Germany was more valuable than accountability for 362 dead soldiers, so the sentences were quietly reduced, then commuted, then forgotten. By 1956, Peiper walked out of prison a free man. The families of those soldiers received no explanation, no apology, no second trial, just silence. And I think that silence is one of the most shameful moments in post-war Western legal history. Not because the system failed accidentally, but because it failed on purpose, for political convenience. After his release, Peiper worked briefly for Porsche, translated military history books, and in 1972 settled in Traves, a sleepy, forgettable village in eastern France near the German border. He used his real name, openly. For a while, his neighbors had no idea who he was. He was just the quiet German man on the hill. Then, in 1974, a former French resistance fighter recognized him. 2 years later, in June 1976, a leftist newspaper published his full name and exact home address. Death threats arrived within days. Now here's the part I genuinely cannot wrap my head around. Peiper had real options. He could have moved. French authorities knew about the threats. His own family begged him to leave. He sent his wife and children back to Germany for their safety, and then he stayed, alone, in that house, with a rifle. Was it arrogance, fatalism, or did a man who spent his entire career making life and death decisions for others finally accept that someone would eventually make that decision for him? I think it was all three, and I think somewhere deep down he knew. The attack came on the night of July 13th, 1976, the eve of Bastille Day, France's celebration of the fall of tyranny. The timing, whether intentional or not, was chilling. Attackers surrounded the property and threw Molotov cocktails. Multiple incendiary devices were recovered from inside and outside the house. Peiper fired back. Spent cartridge casings were found near his body, proving he had discharged his weapons during the assault. But here is the detail that hits hardest. Peiper did not die from gunfire. Forensic investigators determined he died from smoke inhalation, asphyxiation, while apparently trying to salvage belongings from the burning building. The man who commanded the Blowtorch Battalion, the man whose unit burned 240 people alive inside a church, died in smoke and fire, alone in the dark. His body was so badly burned that dental records were required to confirm his identity. A group calling itself the Avengers later claimed responsibility, but French authorities never made a single arrest. The case remains officially unsolved to this day, and I'll be honest, I'm not surprised it was never solved, because I suspect the French authorities who investigated it understood exactly what kind of people they were looking for, and I think some of them quietly decided that this particular file could stay cold. Let me tell you what I actually think. Joachim Peiper was guilty, not just of Malmedy, of a documented years-long pattern of deliberate atrocity across 3 countries. The evidence was never seriously in doubt. That part is not complicated. What is complicated is the system that freed him. The decision to commute those death sentences wasn't about justice. It was a political trade. Hundreds of dead American soldiers exchanged quietly for Cold War alliance management. The families of those men had no voice in that negotiation. They were simply cut out of the equation. And the people who burned that house in Travis, many were former resistance fighters, people who had watched the legal system make its calculation, understood exactly what had been traded away, and concluded that they had no other option left. Does that make what they did right? I genuinely don't know. I've thought about it a lot, and I don't think there's a clean answer, because the moment the legal system made its political calculation in 1956, it surrendered its right to be the only voice on the subject. What Peiper's story ultimately reveals isn't just the brutality of one SS officer. It reveals what happens to justice when it becomes inconvenient, and it asks a question that still has no good answer. When the system fails the dead, who is left to speak for them? Joachim Peiper survived the Eastern Front. He survived the Battle of the Bulge. He survived a death sentence. He did not survive being found. History settled his account in smoke and fire, the same currency he had spent so freely across Russia, Belgium, and Italy. Whether that feels like justice to you or like another crime, that discomfort you're sitting with right now, that's exactly where this story was always going to leave you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where does justice end and vengeance begin? Because with Peiper, there is no clean line. See you in the next episode.